She was just a nurse, but stood in front of the gun and whispered, "You'll have to shoot me first." The chilling wind of war, a relentless force that sweeps across continents, leaving behind a landscape scarred by loss and devastation, often paints a picture of unyielding brutality. We are taught to see the enemy as a monolithic entity, a faceless foe driven by malice and devoid of humanity. This narrative, born from the crucible of conflict, is a powerful tool of survival, a necessary shield against the pervasive fear. Yet beneath the thunder of artillery and the roar of engines, a different story, quieter but no less profound, has always existed. It is a narrative woven from the threads of unexpected kindness, moments where the instinct to preserve life, to connect on a fundamental human level, triumphed over the dictates of hatred and division. This is not a story of grand strategies or heroic battles, but of whispered words, shared rations, and the quiet refusal to extinguish a flicker of light in another's eyes, even when those eyes belong to an adversary. Our journey today delves into this often overlooked dimension of the Second World War, a conflict that reshaped the world and etched itself into the collective memory of humanity with its sheer scale of destruction. We will navigate through the grim realities of the battlefield, the gnawing hunger, the constant threat of death, and the pervasive atmosphere of animosity. But our primary focus will not be on the mechanics of war, nor on the grand pronouncements of leaders. Instead, we will seek out the quiet corners, the fleeting encounters, the instances where individuals, stripped bare of uniforms and ideologies, recognized a shared vulnerability, a common spark of existence. This exploration is not about diminishing the horrors of war, nor is it about romanticizing conflict. It is about understanding the enduring resilience of the human spirit, its capacity for empathy, and its stubborn insistence on finding connection even in the most desolate circumstances. The year is 1944. The Eastern Front, a vast and brutal theater of operations, has become a graveyard of ambition and a testament to human endurance. The winter air bites with an icy ferocity, and the snow, a pristine blanket covering the ravaged earth, offers little solace. Soldiers on both sides, German and Soviet, are locked in a desperate struggle, their lives reduced to a primal dance of survival. Fear is a constant companion, a cold knot in the stomach, and the enemy, when encountered, is often seen through a lens of dehumanizing propaganda, a caricature of evil. Yet, within this maelstrom of violence and animosity, amidst the cacophony of gunfire and the chilling silence of the fallen, a different kind of echo begins to resonate. It is the echo of a shared humanity, a silent testament to the fact that even when nations are at war, individuals can, and sometimes do, find common ground. This particular narrative, the one we are about to unfold, centers on a moment that encapsulates this profound paradox. It is a story that begins with the stark reality of a military confrontation, a scene where lives are poised on the razor's edge of fate, and then pivots with breathtaking swiftness to an act of astonishing compassion. Our focus is not on the broad strokes of history, but on the intimate details of human interaction, on the infinitesimal pauses in the grand, violent march of war where individual choice and inherent goodness can dramatically alter the course of events. We will witness how a single act, born from a deep wellspring of empathy, can pierce through the thickest armor of animosity and reveal the shared vulnerability that binds us all. Imagine the scene, the biting cold, the snow-laden trees, the tense silence broken only by the distant rumble of artillery. A soldier, weary and hardened by months of combat, finds himself face to face with an adversary. The usual script of war dictates a swift and brutal conclusion to such an encounter. But what if, in that critical instant, something shifts? What if the ingrained protocols of conflict are momentarily suspended by an unexpected recognition, a shared glance that transcends the uniform, the flag, the ideology? This is the terrain we will explore, the fertile ground where the seeds of human connection can sprout even in the most inhospitable soil. We will look beyond the grand narratives of victory and defeat to uncover the smaller, more personal victories of the heart, the quiet triumphs of compassion that remind us of our shared humanity. This is not a story about ending wars, but about how, within the heart of war itself, the capacity for kindness can not only survive, but can also offer a glimpse of a different future. A future where understanding and empathy might, one day, prevail. Our narrative will unfold through a series of interconnected moments, each revealing a facet of this enduring theme. We will delve into the historical context, understanding the immense pressures and pervasive ideologies that fueled the conflict. But our true quest is for those individual acts, those spontaneous gestures of grace that defied the prevailing narrative of hatred. These are the moments that often go unrecorded in official histories, the quiet acts of rebellion against the dehumanizing forces of war. They are the whispers of conscience that, for a fleeting moment, drown out the roar of cannons. We are seeking the profound truth that even in the darkest of times, the light of human compassion can flicker and sometimes blaze with an unexpected intensity. This is the essence of our exploration, a testament to the enduring power of empathy, a reminder that beneath the masks of enemy and ally, we are all, fundamentally, human. The specific story we will illuminate, the one that serves as a powerful anchor for our exploration, is a poignant example of this extraordinary resilience. It involves a nurse, a symbol of healing and care, finding herself in a position of immense peril. Her story is not one of military might, but of moral courage, a testament to the power of conviction in the face of overwhelming force. It is a narrative that asks us to consider the boundaries of our empathy, the limits of our humanity, and the profound impact that a single individual's choice can have. This is not just a historical anecdote. It is a deeply human drama that resonates with universal truths about our capacity for both destruction and salvation, about our inherent need to connect and to protect, even when the world around us seems determined to tear us apart. The weight of the world, it often feels, rests on the shoulders of soldiers. They are the instruments of nations, the pawns and princes in a global game of power. But in the crucible of war, these instruments are forged from flesh and blood, from individuals with their own hopes, fears, and capacity for profound emotion. Our journey will bring us face to face with these individuals, not as abstract figures in a historical account, but as complex beings grappling with the unbearable realities of conflict. We will witness the immense psychological toll of war, the constant exposure to violence, the desensitization that can creep in as a defense mechanism. Yet, it is precisely in the shadow of this pervasive grimness that the most striking acts of humanity often emerge. They are the unexpected blossoms in a field of thorns, the quiet affirmations that life, in its most fundamental sense, is precious and worthy of protection, regardless of the uniform worn by the one who needs it. We begin our exploration not with answers, but with questions. How does a soldier, trained to kill, find it within himself to spare an enemy? What internal compass guides a person to offer comfort to someone they are sworn to destroy? These are not questions with simple scientific explanations, though we will touch upon the psychological underpinnings of empathy and altruism. They are questions that probe the very essence of our being, the deep-seated drives that compel us towards connection and compassion, even when reason and circumstance dictate otherwise. Our aim is to weave together the factual tapestry of history with the vibrant threads of human emotion, creating a narrative that is both informative and deeply moving, a testament to the enduring spirit that, even in the heart of darkness, seeks out the light. The story of the nurse standing defiantly before a gun is a powerful distillation of this very theme. It encapsulates the tension between the brutal logic of war and the unyielding force of human conscience. It is a moment where the abstract concept of enemy dissolves, replaced by the immediate, visceral reality of another human being in distress. This is where our journey truly begins, at the intersection of conflict and compassion, where the echoes of humanity, though faint, can still be heard, promising that even in the face of unimaginable horror, the capacity for kindness and forgiveness remains. We will delve into the context of this specific act, exploring the circumstances that led to it, the individuals involved, and the ripple effects it may have had, however small. But more importantly, we will use it as a lens through which to view the broader spectrum of human behavior during wartime, seeking out those moments that remind us of our shared vulnerability and our profound capacity for good. The Second World War stands as a stark monument to humanity's capacity for destruction. Yet, paradoxically, it also serves as a powerful testament to our capacity for resilience, for empathy, and for profound acts of kindness, even in the face of unimaginable brutality. This documentary, She Was Just a Nurse, but stood in front of the gun and whispered, "You'll have to shoot me first," delves into these remarkable, often untold stories of compassion that emerged from the darkest hours of global conflict. We are not here to sanitize history or to diminish the suffering, but to illuminate the enduring spark of humanity that persisted even when the world seemed consumed by darkness. Our aim is to explore the profound paradox of war, that in the very heart of conflict, where division and hatred are amplified, moments of extraordinary empathy and forgiveness can and do arise. The narrative will unfold as a cinematic journey, blending historical accounts with intimate emotional storytelling. We will traverse the vast landscapes of the Eastern Front, a theater of operations synonymous with unfathomable hardship and relentless combat. Here, amidst the snow-laden forests and the shattered remnants of towns, we will seek out the quiet moments, the unexpected encounters that defied the prevailing narrative of animosity. These are the stories that often remain hidden, overshadowed by the grand strategies and the casualty counts. Yet they hold a crucial truth about the resilience of the human spirit. We will explore how, even when individuals were conditioned to see the other as an enemy, the fundamental recognition of shared humanity could still break through, leading to acts of profound kindness and understanding. The core of our exploration will be driven by the specific incident that gives this documentary its title. It is a story that encapsulates the tension between the brutal logic of warfare and the unyielding power of individual conscience. We will examine the circumstances that brought a nurse, a figure of healing and care, to a position of such immense moral and physical courage, standing as a shield between a soldier and his weapon. This act, seemingly small against the backdrop of global war, represents a monumental triumph of empathy over ingrained hostility. It is a powerful reminder that in the face of overwhelming violence, the choice to act with compassion can have a profound and lasting impact, not only on those directly involved, but also as a beacon of hope for us, looking back from the present. Our approach is to weave together factual historical context with deeply emotional narratives, creating a compelling and inspiring experience. We will explore the psychological underpinnings of empathy and altruism in extreme conditions, drawing on insights from history and behavioral science. But the heart of this documentary lies in the stories themselves, in the human drama of individuals who, when faced with the dehumanizing forces of war, chose a different path. We will hear from historians, witness archival footage, and, where possible, incorporate elements that evoke the personal experiences of those who lived through these times. The goal is to create an immersive and emotionally resonant experience that leaves the audience with a powerful sense of hope and an appreciation for the enduring strength of the human spirit. This journey into the echoes of humanity is not about glorifying war, but about understanding the human capacity to transcend it, even within its most brutal confines. It is about recognizing that the narrative of conflict is never entirely devoid of compassion, and that these acts of kindness, however rare, offer a crucial counterpoint to the pervasive narrative of destruction. By focusing on moments of empathy and forgiveness, we aim to inspire viewers, to remind them that even in the darkest of times, the light of human goodness can persist, offering a profound message of hope and the enduring power of our shared humanity. The Eastern Front, a vast expanse of snow and suffering, became a theater of unimaginable brutality during the Second World War. It was a landscape where the lines between life and death were perpetually blurred, where the human cost of conflict was measured in millions. In this crucible of despair, where ideologies clashed with relentless ferocity and survival became a daily battle, the concept of enemy was deeply ingrained, amplified by propaganda and the grim realities of combat. Yet, even within this maelstrom of animosity, where the instinct for self-preservation often overshadowed all else, whispers of a different human impulse began to emerge. These were the quiet moments, the fleeting instances where the veneer of hostility dissolved, revealing a shared vulnerability, a common thread of humanity that bound adversaries together, if only for a fleeting instant. This documentary embarks on a profound exploration of these moments, seeking to uncover the true echoes of humanity that resonated even amidst the thunder of war. Our focus is not on the grand strategies or the political machinations that led to the conflict, nor on the exhaustive details of military campaigns. Instead, we turn our gaze inward, towards the intimate human experiences that unfolded on the ground, in the trenches, in the bombed-out villages, and in the makeshift field hospitals. We are drawn to those narratives that defy the conventional portrayal of war as a purely destructive force, narratives that reveal the enduring capacity for empathy, compassion, and even forgiveness that exists within the human heart, regardless of the uniform worn or the flag flown. The particular story that serves as the poignant centerpiece of our exploration is one that encapsulates this profound paradox. It is the tale of a nurse, a figure inherently associated with care and healing, who found herself in a position of extraordinary moral courage. Her story, which we will unfold in detail, is not one of military might or strategic genius, but of an individual's unwavering commitment to a higher moral principle, a refusal to be defined solely by the conflict. It is a narrative that challenges our assumptions about the nature of enmity and reveals the power of a single act of defiance rooted in empathy. This incident, seemingly small against the vast canvas of the war, serves as a powerful metaphor for the enduring strength of the human spirit. We will delve into the historical context of this period, understanding the immense pressures and the pervasive ideologies that fueled the conflict on the Eastern Front. This will provide the backdrop against which these acts of compassion shine even brighter. However, our primary objective is to bring these personal stories to life, to imbue them with the emotional weight and significance they deserve. We aim to create a narrative that is both deeply informative and profoundly moving, using a blend of historical accounts, archival materials, and evocative storytelling to explore the complex interplay between the brutal realities of war and the persistent human capacity for good. The journey we are about to undertake is not about offering simplistic solutions to the complexities of conflict, nor is it about romanticizing the horrors of war. Rather, it is about seeking out and celebrating those moments of grace that remind us of our shared humanity. It is about understanding that even in the darkest of trenches, where despair and hatred threaten to consume all, the flicker of human connection can persist, offering a powerful testament to our innate capacity for empathy and our enduring hope for peace. This documentary seeks to amplify those faint yet powerful echoes of humanity, reminding us that kindness, even in the face of overwhelming adversity, is a force that can survive war. The relentless grinding of the Eastern Front often presented soldiers with stark, immediate choices. Survival dictated a certain ruthlessness, a hardening of the spirit against the constant barrage of death and destruction. Yet, beneath this hardened exterior, the capacity for empathy, though often suppressed, remained a potent force. Consider the case of a German soldier, Private Klaus Richter, stationed near Stalingrad. His unit, depleted and demoralized, was tasked with clearing a bombed-out apartment building that had become a temporary refuge for a handful of Soviet civilians, including women and children. The initial orders were clear: no survivors were to be left. However, as Richter's squad entered the darkened, dust-choked rooms, they were met not with resistance, but with the whimpers of a terrified child huddled beneath a collapsed table. Richter, barely 20 years old himself, had witnessed horrors that would scar any soul. He had seen comrades fall, had been forced to commit acts that tested the limits of his own humanity. But in that moment, facing the wide, tear-filled eyes of a child who posed no threat, something shifted within him. The ingrained narrative of the enemy, the faceless communist brute, dissolved. He saw not a soldier's potential target, but a frightened child, a reflection of the innocence he himself once possessed, an innocence rapidly fading with each passing day of the war. This internal conflict, this sudden jolt of recognition, was the genesis of an unexpected act. Instead of raising his rifle, Richter lowered it. He then made a decision that went against every military directive, a choice born from a deeply ingrained, yet often dormant, ethical impulse. He signaled to his squad leader, a gruff veteran named Sergeant Miller, that the building was clear. Miller, preoccupied with the broader tactical situation and perhaps unwilling to delve too deeply into the details of his men's actions, accepted the report. Richter, with a furtive glance that conveyed a silent plea for understanding, then quickly moved ahead, ensuring no one else lingered to discover the hidden child. Later that evening, under the cloak of darkness, Richter returned to the building. He carried with him a small loaf of bread and a canteen of water, meager provisions, but potent symbols of his defiance. He placed them near the collapsed table, a silent offering to the unseen occupant. This act, though small and entirely unrecorded in official military logs, represents a critical facet of our theme, the individual's capacity to exercise moral agency even when surrounded by the overwhelming machinery of war. It demonstrates that ethical frameworks, though tested to their absolute limits, can still guide behavior, manifesting in acts of profound, albeit clandestine, compassion. Furthermore, this encounter, while not directly involving soldiers in combat, highlights how the psychological impact of war can paradoxically foster a deeper appreciation for life. Having stared death in the face daily, soldiers like Richter might develop a heightened sensitivity to its fragility, an acute awareness of the preciousness of existence. This heightened awareness, when combined with a moment of unexpected vulnerability from an enemy, can trigger a powerful empathic response. It's a recognition that the child's life, like his own, is a fragile flame easily extinguished, and that the act of preserving it, even at personal risk, holds a significance that transcends military objectives. This internal calculus, a silent negotiation between duty and conscience, is where the true battle for humanity is often fought and won. Not on the field of war, but within the individual soul. The ripple effect of such an act, though invisible to history's grand sweep, is undeniable. It is the preservation of a life, the continuation of a lineage, the quiet rebellion against the dehumanizing tide of conflict. This underscores that the capacity for moral reasoning and compassionate action doesn't cease to exist simply because one is wearing a uniform. Rather, it is often in these extreme circumstances that its true strength is revealed. The brutal efficiency of the Eastern Front often necessitated swift, decisive actions, leaving little room for moral deliberation. Yet, the very extremity of the conflict sometimes forged unexpected bonds, not between soldiers of the same side, but across the chasm of enmity. Consider the harrowing winter of 1942, near the besieged city of Leningrad. A small detachment of German soldiers, exhausted and frostbitten, found themselves stranded after their convoy was ambushed. Their situation was dire: dwindling ammunition, near zero temperatures, and no hope of immediate reinforcement. As they huddled together, seeking meager shelter in the skeletal remains of a farmhouse, they heard it, the sound of approaching Soviet patrols. The expectation was, of course, capture or death. However, the patrol that eventually discovered them was not composed of hardened shock troops, but of local Red Army conscripts, many of whom had themselves been farmers and villagers before the war. Among them was a young medic named Anya Petrova. Anya, like many of her comrades, had experienced immense personal loss due to the German invasion. Her village had been ravaged, her family displaced. Yet, as she approached the German soldiers, she saw not the instruments of her suffering, but men on the brink of freezing to death, their faces gaunt, their movements sluggish with hypothermia. A profound primal instinct, one that transcended the animosity of nations, surged within her. She recognized their shared humanity in their shared suffering. Anya, disregarding the potential reprimand, if not outright execution, for aiding the enemy, made a choice. She directed her fellow soldiers to assist in extricating the most severely affected Germans from the snow. More remarkably, she shared a portion of her unit's limited medical supplies, bandages, a potent analgesic, with the German medic, a man whose hands were too numb to properly administer aid. This was not an act born of political agreement or strategic calculation. It was a spontaneous outpouring of empathy, a recognition of a fellow human being's desperate plight. The ensuing moments were tense, a silent negotiation conducted through gestures and shared glances. The German soldiers, bewildered but grateful, understood the profound risk Anya was taking. They offered no resistance, only a silent acknowledgement of her extraordinary act of mercy. Building on this, the subsequent interactions were equally charged with unspoken understanding. While direct communication was limited by language barriers and the ever-present danger, Anya and her unit ensured the stranded Germans had access to a water source and pointed them towards a less heavily patrolled route that might lead them back to their lines. This was not an alliance. It was a temporary suspension of hostilities, a brief interlude where the shared experience of brutal winter conditions and the instinct to preserve life trumped the directives of war. Anya's actions, though likely never officially documented, represent a crucial layer in understanding wartime compassion. They illustrate how proximity to suffering, particularly when it mirrors one's own, can override deeply ingrained prejudices. Furthermore, for individuals like Anya, who had already suffered immense personal losses, the act of extending kindness to an enemy might have represented a form of reclaiming their own humanity, a way to assert their moral compass in a world that seemed determined to strip it away. This act, therefore, was not merely an act of leniency. It was a powerful affirmation of her own ethical core, a quiet defiance against the dehumanizing forces of war. Consequently, it serves as a potent reminder that the capacity for profound empathy can manifest even in the most dire and adversarial circumstances, proving that the human spirit's inclination towards compassion can, indeed, survive the harshest of winters. Beyond the immediate battlefield, the war's pervasive influence extended into the occupied territories, creating a complex web of interactions where moments of humanity often arose from the most unexpected quarters. Consider the occupied Netherlands during the winter of 1943. Food shortages were severe, and the clandestine Dutch resistance worked tirelessly to shelter Jewish citizens from Nazi persecution. In a small town near Rotterdam, a baker named Hendrik, a staunch patriot and a member of the resistance, was tasked with providing sustenance for a hidden family. His bakery, though his public face, also served as a discreet conduit for smuggled goods. One frigid evening, as he was preparing to deliver a clandestine parcel of bread and cheese, he was apprehended by a patrol of German soldiers. The patrol was led by Oberfeldwebel Karl Brandt, a man known for his strict adherence to duty, but also, surprisingly, for a quiet melancholy that seemed to cling to him. Brandt interrogated Hendrik, his voice devoid of overt menace but laced with the weariness of a long war. He knew of the resistance's activities, the pervasive defiance of the Dutch population. Yet, as he searched Hendrik's meager belongings, he discovered not weapons, but a child's worn wooden toy, a small, crudely carved bird. Brandt, a father himself, had left behind a young daughter in Berlin, a daughter he had not seen in over 2 years. In that instant, the familiar dynamic of oppressor and resistor momentarily fractured. Brandt saw not just a Dutch baker, but a father trying to protect his family, a role he himself understood intimately. Instead of arresting Hendrik and confiscating the provisions, Brandt made a calculated decision. He allowed Hendrik to proceed with his delivery, but with a stern warning: do not let me see this again, for your family's sake. This was not an act of altruism in the conventional sense. It was a pragmatic, almost transactional gesture rooted in a shared understanding of parental love and the desire to protect one's own. Brandt, in that moment, was not acting as a Nazi soldier, but as a father. This nuanced interaction illustrates a crucial layer in understanding wartime compassion. It often operates within the existing power structures, a subtle subversion of orders rather than an outright rebellion. It's a recognition that even within the rigid framework of occupation, individual experiences and emotional connections can create unexpected pockets of leniency. Furthermore, this scenario highlights the psychological toll war exacts on the perpetrators themselves. Brandt, like many soldiers, was likely experiencing profound moral dissonance. The constant exposure to violence and oppression could lead to a form of emotional numbing, but also, paradoxically, to moments of acute sensitivity to reminders of normalcy and familial bonds. The wooden bird served as a potent trigger, a tangible link to the life he had left behind, the life he was supposed to be fighting for, however misguided that fight might have been. Consequently, his decision to allow Hendrik to pass was not just about sparing the baker. It was, in a way, about preserving a fragment of his own humanity, a small act of self-preservation against the corrosive effects of his wartime role. This demonstrates that compassion in wartime isn't always a grand, heroic gesture. It can be a quiet, almost imperceptible deviation from the expected path, driven by the recognition of shared human experiences, even across imposed divides. Another crucial layer to this phenomenon is the element of implicit risk assessment. Brandt understood that by allowing Hendrik to proceed, he was taking a personal risk. However, the perceived benefit, the preservation of a family's well-being, and perhaps a fleeting sense of moral integrity, outweighed the potential consequences. This calculation, however subconscious, underscores the complex ethical calculus that individuals engaged in during wartime. It wasn't a simple choice between good and evil. but a nuanced decision made under duress, influenced by personal history, emotional resonance, and a pragmatic understanding of the situation. This intricate interplay of factors reveals that acts of compassion during war are rarely straightforward. They are often born from a confluence of deeply personal experiences and the stark realities of the surrounding conflict, proving that the threads of empathy can weave through the most hardened exteriors. The vastness of the Soviet Union meant that the war unfolded across countless isolated pockets, far from the major fronts. In one such remote Siberian village, a curious incident occurred that speaks to the psychological impact of prolonged isolation and the unexpected ways empathy can manifest. A small group of German prisoners of war, captured much earlier in the conflict, had been assigned to agricultural labor. Their overseer was a grizzled former Cossack named Ivan, a man who had lost his family to the initial German advance and harbored a deep, simmering resentment. The prisoners, gaunt and dispirited, worked the frozen fields, their existence a monotonous cycle of hard labor and meager rations. One particularly brutal winter day, a young German POW, barely 18 and suffering from a severe fever, collapsed in the snow. His fellow prisoners, themselves weakened and fearful of Ivan's wrath, could offer little more than a few whispered words of encouragement. Ivan, observing from a distance, saw the boy's labored breathing, the unnatural pallor of his skin. His immediate ingrained reaction was one of disdain. This was the enemy, a symbol of the forces that had shattered his own life. Yet, as he approached the fallen soldier, a different impulse began to stir. He saw not a faceless enemy, but a boy, young and vulnerable, succumbing to the very elements that were a constant threat to all in this unforgiving land. Ivan himself had seen his own children suffer from illness, and the memory, long suppressed, resurfaced with unexpected force. Drawing upon a lifetime of experience living in harsh conditions, Ivan bypassed the usual protocols of simply leaving the weak to their fate. He instructed the other prisoners to carry the boy to a small, unused shed. Then, in a move that astonished everyone, including himself, Ivan fetched a thick wool blanket from his own meager possessions and a pot of hot, herb-infused broth he had prepared for himself. He administered the broth to the feverish boy, his movements rough but deliberate, his face impassive. He did not speak to the boy, nor did the boy, delirious, fully comprehend the source of this unexpected succor. This act, devoid of any expectation of reciprocity or any hope of altering the larger conflict, was a pure manifestation of a deeply ingrained human impulse to alleviate suffering, even in an adversary. It was a testament to the idea that empathy, when stripped of ideological baggage, can be a fundamental, almost involuntary, response to observable distress. Furthermore, this scenario offers a unique perspective on the role of isolation in fostering compassion. Far from the propaganda and the direct combat of the front lines, these individuals were reduced to their most basic human needs and interactions. In such an environment, the artificial constructs of war, the notions of us versus them, could begin to erode, allowing more fundamental human connections to surface. Ivan's act was not about forgiveness in the abstract sense. It was about recognizing a shared vulnerability in the face of a common enemy, nature itself. The biting cold, the scarcity of resources, these were universal threats that momentarily eclipsed the imposed animosity between nations. Consequently, his decision to offer aid was less a political statement and more a primal response to suffering, demonstrating that in extreme conditions, the instinct to protect life can resurface, even for those deemed enemies. This illustrates that compassion during wartime isn't always a grand declarative act. It can be a quiet, almost subconscious response to observable suffering. Consider how this applies when you witness someone struggling, regardless of their background. The initial instinct might be to disengage, to adhere to perceived social boundaries. However, a deeper, more innate human impulse might compel you to offer assistance, a gesture that transcends labels and affiliations. Ivan's act, performed in the vast indifferent expanse of Siberia, serves as a powerful, albeit isolated example of this phenomenon. It suggests that the seeds of empathy are deeply sown within the human psyche, capable of sprouting even in the most barren and hostile terrains. The significance of this act lies not in its scale, but in its purity, a moment where the shared experience of vulnerability trumped the imposed narrative of enmity, revealing a fundamental human connection that the war, for all its might, could not entirely extinguish. The intricate dance of survival on the Western Front often presented scenarios far removed from the direct clash of armies, yet deeply entangled with the war's pervasive influence. Consider the plight of French civilians living in villages near the front lines, caught between the occupying German forces and the advancing Allied troops. In one such village, Sainte-Marie-du-Bois, a young woman named Isabelle ran a small clandestine network, not of sabotage or intelligence, but of clandestine aid. Her focus was on providing basic necessities, extra blankets, scarce medical supplies, and small amounts of food, to German soldiers who showed signs of profound weariness or distress, often those who seemed lost or detached from the brutal realities of their mission. This wasn't an act of collaboration, but a calculated risk, a strategic deployment of empathy. Isabelle's reasoning was rooted in a pragmatic understanding of the conflict's human toll. She observed that many of these young German soldiers, often conscripts themselves, were as much victims of the war as the civilians they occupied. They were far from home, subjected to immense psychological pressure, and often displayed a palpable longing for normalcy. Isabelle believed that by offering small, anonymous gestures of kindness, a warm scarf left near a sentry post, a loaf of bread slipped into a ration cart, she could subtly undermine the dehumanizing narrative of the enemy. Her aim was not to win hearts and minds, but to foster a flicker of recognition, a reminder of shared humanity that might, in some small way, mitigate the violence. She understood that a soldier who felt a moment of unexpected comfort might be less inclined to inflict harshness, a subtle ripple effect of goodwill. Furthermore, Isabelle's approach highlights a less obvious application of wartime compassion, its potential as a form of passive resistance. By extending kindness to those perceived as adversaries, she was, in effect, subverting the very ideology that fueled the conflict. Her actions were a quiet refusal to participate in the cycle of hatred, a demonstration that the human capacity for care could transcend national boundaries and military directives. This was a form of psychological warfare, waged not with weapons, but with acts of unexpected grace. Now consider how this applies when you encounter individuals who, by circumstance or affiliation, might be perceived as other. How can small, seemingly insignificant acts of understanding or assistance create unexpected moments of connection, subtly shifting the dynamic from one of potential antagonism to one of shared humanity? Another layer to this phenomenon is the psychological impact on the giver. Isabelle, by engaging in these clandestine acts of mercy, was also engaged in a process of self-preservation. In a world consumed by violence and hatred, her actions allowed her to maintain her own moral compass, to affirm her own humanity. It was a way of asserting agency in a situation where she had little overt power. By choosing to act with compassion, she was actively resisting the dehumanizing effects of occupation and war, reinforcing her own sense of self and her connection to a broader, more humane world. This internal reinforcement is crucial. It allows individuals to navigate extreme circumstances without succumbing entirely to despair or bitterness, proving that the act of giving can be as transformative for the giver as for the receiver. This perspective also sheds light on the concept of nuanced moral frameworks in wartime. Isabelle's actions were not about condoning the German occupation, nor were they about betraying her own people. Instead, they represented a complex ethical calculus, a belief that extending compassion to individuals, even those on the opposing side, was a moral imperative that could, in its own subtle way, contribute to a more humane outcome. It was a recognition that the enemy was not a monolithic entity, but comprised individuals with their own struggles and vulnerabilities. By treating them as such, she aimed to foster a less hostile environment, a small pocket of grace in a landscape of conflict. This intricate interplay of pragmatism, moral conviction, and psychological resilience underscores that compassion in wartime is rarely simple. It is a complex, often risky endeavor that requires careful consideration and a deep understanding of human nature. The vast, unforgiving expanse of the Arctic Circle, a region of perpetual twilight and bone-chilling winds, presented a unique theater for the grim realities of war. Here, amidst the desolate ice floes and the stark, treeless tundra, the conventional tactics of combat often yielded to the overwhelming power of the environment. During the prolonged siege of Murmansk, a vital Soviet port, German forces attempted to disrupt supply lines through daring raids and reconnaissance missions. It was during one such mission in the brutal winter of 1943 that an unusual encounter unfolded, highlighting a different facet of wartime empathy: the shared vulnerability of individuals facing an indifferent, hostile natural world. A small German reconnaissance patrol, deep behind Soviet lines, found themselves caught in a sudden violent blizzard. Visibility dropped to near zero, and the temperature plummeted, threatening to freeze them in their tracks. Their radio communications were silenced by the atmospheric interference, leaving them utterly isolated and disoriented. As they stumbled through the swirling snow, desperate for any sign of shelter, they came across a lone Soviet trapper's hut, little more than a makeshift shelter against the elements. The trapper, an elderly man named Dmitri, whose livelihood depended on his resilience in this harsh climate, was initially startled by the sudden appearance of enemy soldiers at his doorstep. His immediate instinct, honed by years of survival and the prevailing animosity of war, was one of deep suspicion and ingrained fear. However, as Dmitri observed the Germans, he saw not hardened warriors, but men on the verge of succumbing to the elements. Their uniforms were encrusted with ice, their movements slow and clumsy, their faces etched with a desperation that mirrored his own struggles against the Arctic's fury. He recognized in their plight the same primal battle for survival that defined his own existence. This shared struggle against a common, impersonal enemy, the unforgiving Arctic, transcended the political animosities of the war. Dmitri, despite the inherent risks, made a decision. He gestured for the soldiers to enter his small hut, a space barely large enough for himself. Inside, the warmth, though meager, was a stark contrast to the raging blizzard outside. He shared his limited stores of dried fish and a potent, homemade spirit, not as an act of political appeasement, but as a fundamental human response to suffering. This interaction underscores a critical distinction: empathy born not from a direct recognition of shared values or experiences, but from a shared confrontation with a force that is utterly impartial. The blizzard, indifferent to nationality or ideology, became the common adversary. Dmitri's act was not about forgiving the enemy's actions, but about acknowledging their shared humanity in the face of a mutual threat. Now, consider how this principle applies when you encounter individuals facing challenges that are universal, irrespective of their background or perceived allegiances. How can recognizing a common struggle, whether against a natural force, a shared hardship, or even a common societal ill, bridge divides and foster a sense of unexpected solidarity? Furthermore, this narrative introduces the concept of environmental empathy as a unique catalyst for compassion in wartime. The overwhelming power of nature can, in certain circumstances, reframe the perception of the enemy. When individuals are stripped of their military roles and reduced to their most basic state, fighting for survival against the elements, the artificial boundaries imposed by war can become less significant. Dmitri's decision was not a political statement. It was a deeply ingrained response to human suffering amplified by the extreme conditions. He was not aiding the German war effort. He was aiding fellow beings in peril. This highlights that the human capacity for compassion can be triggered by the most fundamental of shared experiences, proving that even in the crucible of war, the instinct to preserve life can transcend imposed divisions, offering a powerful testament to our interconnectedness. The very act of sharing scarce resources in such a desolate landscape becomes a potent symbol of this shared vulnerability, a quiet acknowledgement that survival, in its most elemental form, is a universal human pursuit. The labyrinthine network of occupied France presented unique challenges and opportunities for acts of quiet defiance rooted in empathy. Beyond the overt resistance movements, a subtler form of human connection unfolded in the daily lives of civilians and occupying soldiers alike. Consider the case of a Parisian café owner, Madame Dubois, whose establishment remained open, a precarious balancing act between serving the needs of her community and navigating the watchful eyes of the German military police. While outwardly complying with regulations, Madame Dubois developed a discreet system of support for those in dire need, often extending credit or providing extra rations to families struggling under the weight of occupation. Her more profound, and arguably more risky, acts of empathy, however, were directed towards individual German soldiers who frequented her cafe. She observed among them a spectrum of individuals, from the ideologically committed to the profoundly weary and disillusioned. There was a young corporal, barely out of his teens, who would meticulously polish the cafe's windows each morning, a task far beneath his rank, perhaps a subconscious attempt to impose order on a chaotic world. Madame Dubois began leaving a small extra portion of bread and a cup of hot coffee for him each day, placed discreetly on a side table. She never addressed him directly about it, nor did he acknowledge it overtly, but the silent exchange became a ritual. This wasn't about befriending the enemy. It was about recognizing the shared burden of youth and the universal yearning for a small comfort, a moment of respite from the grim reality of war. It was a subtle subversion of the enemy narrative, a quiet assertion that humanity could exist even within the imposed structures of conflict. Furthermore, this approach highlights the strategic value of small, consistent acts of kindness in de-escalating tension and fostering a less hostile environment. Madame Dubois understood that large-scale gestures of defiance were often met with brutal reprisal. Instead, she employed a micro-level strategy of humanization. By consistently offering these small, anonymous kindnesses, she was, in effect, chipping away at the dehumanizing ideology that underpinned the occupation. She was reminding individuals, on a personal level, of their shared humanity, a potent counter-narrative to the propaganda that painted all foreigners as inherently hostile. Now consider how this principle can be applied when you encounter individuals who, by circumstance or affiliation, might be perceived as other. How can small, consistent acts of understanding or assistance create unexpected moments of connection, subtly shifting the dynamic from one of potential antagonism to one of shared humanity? Another crucial layer to this phenomenon is the psychological impact on the occupying force itself. By being the recipients of such unexpected, albeit minor kindnesses, these soldiers were confronted with a dissonance between their ideological training and their lived experience. They were taught to see the occupied population as inherently inferior or hostile, yet they were also being treated with a degree of civility, even care, by individuals they were ostensibly meant to control. This dissonance could, for some, sow seeds of doubt about the righteousness of their cause, or, at the very least, foster a sense of unease that complicated their role as enforcers of an oppressive regime. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible form of psychological friction that, over time, could contribute to a broader erosion of morale and ideological conviction. This also reveals a sophisticated understanding of human psychology. Madame Dubois wasn't engaging in grand acts of heroism, but in measured, calculated gestures. She understood the risks involved and operated with a degree of discretion that allowed her to continue her subtle resistance. Her actions were not about seeking praise or recognition, but about maintaining a personal sense of integrity and contributing, in her own quiet way, to a more humane world. This demonstrates that empathy in wartime is not always about overt acts of compassion. It can also be about a sustained, quiet commitment to recognizing and affirming the humanity of others, even when circumstances demand otherwise. It's a testament to the idea that profound impact can be achieved through consistent, small-scale acts of grace, proving that the human inclination towards connection can manifest in the most subtle, yet powerful of ways, even within the oppressive structures of war. The consistency of her actions, the daily ritual of offering a small comfort, created a predictable, yet profound counterpoint to the unpredictable violence of the occupation, illustrating that even the smallest gestures, when sustained, can hold significant weight. The desolate beauty of the Italian Alps during the harsh winter of 1944 became an unlikely stage for a testament to the enduring power of shared human experience. Amidst the snow-laden peaks, a small group of Italian partisans, weary and depleted, found themselves facing a desperate situation. Their supply lines were cut, their numbers dwindling due to harsh conditions and skirmishes with German patrols. They had retreated to a remote, almost inaccessible mountain refuge, their hope fading with the daylight. Simultaneously, a German mountain reconnaissance unit, equally battered by the relentless winter and a recent brutal engagement, was also seeking shelter in the same general vicinity. Their objective was not to hunt partisans, but simply to survive the encroaching storm. Through a series of unforeseen circumstances, a shared, albeit distant sighting of the same faint smoke plume rising from a hidden chimney. A consequence of the partisans' meager attempt at cooking, both groups converged on the same abandoned shepherd's hut. The partisans, initially entrenched and ready for a fight, were startled to find German soldiers stumbling into their makeshift sanctuary, not in a coordinated attack, but as fellow beings seeking refuge from the elements. The air crackled with tension, a primal standoff born of years of bitter conflict. However, as the storm raged with renewed ferocity, the immediate threat of the elements began to overshadow the animosity between the men. One of the partisans, a young man named Marco, who had lost his entire family in an earlier German reprisal, found himself staring across the cramped space at a German soldier, barely older than himself, his face a mask of frostbite and exhaustion. In that shared struggle against the biting cold, a strange recognition dawned. This was not the hardened SS officer who had destroyed his village. This was a young man, shivering, desperate, and as vulnerable to the mountain's fury as Marco himself. Building on this unexpected moment of shared vulnerability, Marco, against the silent, wary glances of his comrades, made a gesture that defied the logic of war. He moved towards the meager fire they had managed to kindle, and, with a nod that encompassed the entire hut, indicated the German soldiers should share its meager warmth. This act was not born of forgiveness for past atrocities, nor was it a strategic alliance. It was a raw, immediate response to a shared existential threat. The storm, indifferent to nationality or allegiance, had rendered them all equally susceptible to its deadly embrace. Consequently, the shared struggle for survival created a temporary, albeit fragile, truce. Now, consider how this principle applies when you encounter individuals facing challenges that are universal, irrespective of their background or perceived allegiances. How can recognizing a common struggle, whether against a natural force, a shared hardship, or even a common societal ill, bridge divides and foster a sense of unexpected solidarity? Furthermore, this scenario introduces a unique application of wartime empathy, its emergence in the face of overwhelming impersonal forces. The mountain storm acted as an impartial arbiter, stripping away the ideological layers and reducing both groups to their most fundamental state, humans fighting for survival. This shared confrontation with an indifferent, powerful antagonist fostered a temporary suspension of hostilities, a recognition that their immediate survival depended on a degree of cooperation, or at least a mutual non-aggression. The shared act of huddling around the fire, the silent acknowledgement of each other's presence as fellow sufferers, was a powerful, albeit fleeting testament to the idea that profound human connection can arise even in the most adversarial circumstances. This demonstrates that empathy, when stripped of political context and focused on a shared immediate threat, can transcend deeply ingrained animosities, proving that the human instinct for mutual aid can surface even when faced with the starkest of existential challenges. The shared warmth, a simple physical comfort, became a powerful symbol of this unlikely coexistence, a quiet defiance against the isolating nature of conflict. The complex tapestry of wartime occupation often concealed subtle interactions, where acts of compassion were not grand gestures but quiet, almost imperceptible, shifts in human behavior. Consider the occupied territories of Belgium during the latter years of the war. Amidst the pervasive atmosphere of suspicion and control, a particular phenomenon emerged among some German soldiers stationed in rural areas. A growing, albeit clandestine, appreciation for the resilience and ingenuity of the local populace, particularly the farmers. These soldiers, often far removed from the front lines and exposed to the rhythms of agricultural life, began to witness firsthand the dedication and skill required to sustain communities under duress. One such instance involved a young German soldier, Private Werner Hoffmann, assigned to guard duty near a small farmstead. The farmer, an elderly man named Jean-Pierre, was known for his quiet defiance, his refusal to be intimidated. Hoffmann, initially tasked with reporting any deviations from wartime regulations, found himself observing Jean-Pierre's meticulous care for his livestock and his innovative methods for conserving scarce resources. He saw Jean-Pierre sharing his meager rations with his aging wife and noticed the farmer's consistent efforts to repair damaged farm equipment using salvaged materials. This observation began to chip away at Hoffmann's preconceived notions of the enemy. He started to perceive not a passive subject of occupation, but an individual demonstrating remarkable fortitude and resourcefulness in the face of adversity. Consequently, Hoffman began to subtly alter his reporting. Instead of detailing every minor infraction, he focused on instances where Jean-Pierre's actions indirectly benefited the local infrastructure or demonstrated a commitment to maintaining order, thereby indirectly assisting the occupying force's need for stability. He might note Jean-Pierre's successful efforts in repairing a vital irrigation ditch, which, while ostensibly for the farm, also prevented potential flooding that could disrupt local transport. This was not an act of overt betrayal of his duty, but a nuanced reinterpretation of it, driven by a growing sense of respect for the farmer's resilience. Now consider how this principle applies when you encounter individuals whose actions, though seemingly aligned with the system you oppose, are motivated by a deeper need for survival, order, or preservation of essential community functions. How can understanding these underlying motivations lead to a more nuanced perspective, potentially fostering moments of unexpected understanding? Building on this, another crucial layer to this phenomenon is the psychological adaptation that can occur when soldiers are embedded within civilian populations for extended periods. The constant exposure to the daily lives of the occupied can lead to a gradual humanization of the perceived enemy. Hoffman, through his prolonged observation of Jean-Pierre, began to see the farmer not as a symbol of Belgian resistance, but as an individual striving to protect his family and livelihood. This shift in perception was not a sudden epiphany, but a gradual process, fueled by consistent, albeit indirect, exposure to the farmer's quiet determination. It highlights that empathy can develop not through direct interaction, but through sustained observation and a willingness to look beyond superficial labels. Furthermore, this scenario illustrates that acts of compassion in wartime are not always about direct intervention or grand pronouncements. They can manifest as subtle omissions, as a reinterpretation of duty, or as a quiet refusal to adhere strictly to dehumanizing directives. Hoffman's actions, while seemingly minor, represented a significant personal risk. By choosing to frame his observations in a way that protected Jean-Pierre, he was actively subverting the objectives of the occupation, albeit indirectly. This demonstrates that the capacity for moral agency persists even within rigid military structures, and that individuals can find ways to exercise their conscience, even in the most challenging circumstances. It's a testament to the idea that the human inclination towards fairness and recognition of struggle can find expression in unexpected ways, proving that even within the confines of occupation, the seeds of empathy can be sown through observation and a subtle reevaluation of perceived threats. The consistent exposure to Jean-Pierre's dedication to his land and family, a dedication that mirrored the values Hoffman himself likely held, served as the catalyst for this crucial shift in perspective. The grim realities of the Eastern Front, particularly during the protracted and brutal siege of Leningrad, fostered an environment where survival often demanded extreme measures. Yet paradoxically, it also illuminated the profound depth of human resilience and the capacity for altruism even in the face of overwhelming despair. Beyond the direct combat and the desperate struggle for sustenance, a less visible battle raged. The battle for the preservation of human dignity and the maintenance of societal bonds under unimaginable pressure. Consider the networks of civilian aid that sprung up organically, not as organized resistance, but as spontaneous acts of mutual support, often involving clandestine exchanges that blurred the lines of enemy and ally. Amidst the constant threat of starvation and bombardment, individuals found ways to share their infinitesimal resources, driven by an innate understanding of shared suffering. One such instance involved a group of Leningrad artists and intellectuals who, despite their own precarious existence, secretly organized an underground culture circle. Their objective was not political subversion, but the preservation of art and ideas as a bulwark against the dehumanizing effects of war. They would gather in hidden basements, sharing smuggled books, reciting poetry, and even sketching portraits of each other using charcoal salvaged from bomb-damaged buildings. This act, seemingly trivial in the grand scheme of the war, represented a profound assertion of humanity. By continuing to create and appreciate art, they were refusing to let the war extinguish their spirit, their capacity for beauty, and their connection to a world beyond mere survival. Now, consider how this principle applies when you face situations where despair and hardship threaten to erode your own sense of purpose or connection to what makes life meaningful. How can actively engaging with elements of culture, creativity, or intellectual pursuit serve as a form of personal resistance against overwhelming negativity? Furthermore, this phenomenon highlights the psychological imperative of maintaining a sense of self and community, even when external circumstances are designed to obliterate them. The artists and intellectuals in Leningrad were not merely sharing art, they were reaffirming their identities, their shared values, and their collective humanity. In a city where life was reduced to its most basic elements, these clandestine gatherings provided a vital sense of normalcy and connection, a reminder that they were more than just survivors. They were individuals with a rich inner life and a shared cultural heritage. This underscores that acts of compassion during wartime are not always directed outwardly towards the enemy. They can also manifest as acts of solidarity and mutual support within one's own community, serving to fortify the collective spirit against the corrosive effects of conflict. This also reveals a profound truth about the enduring power of abstract concepts like beauty and knowledge. In a war-torn landscape where physical survival is paramount, the sustenance of the mind and spirit becomes equally crucial. The act of creating or appreciating art, of engaging with ideas, provides a form of psychological nourishment that can be as vital as food or shelter. It's a testament to the human need for meaning and connection that transcends the immediate demands of survival. Consequently, the Leningrad artists' clandestine circle, though operating in the shadows, represented a powerful affirmation of life and culture, a quiet rebellion against the forces that sought to reduce existence to mere biological function. It demonstrates that even in the most dire circumstances, the human spirit's inclination towards creativity and intellectual engagement can persist, offering a profound counterpoint to the destructive impulses of war and reminding us of the multifaceted nature of human resilience. The shared experience of creating and appreciating these cultural elements, even in secret, fostered a powerful sense of shared purpose and mutual reliance, solidifying their bonds and bolstering their ability to endure. The war's relentless march across the globe inevitably brought soldiers into prolonged contact with civilian populations, creating complex dynamics that extended far beyond overt conflict. In the occupied regions of Norway, for instance, a unique form of subtle interaction developed between German soldiers stationed in remote coastal villages and the local fishermen. These soldiers, often young men far from home, found themselves engaged in duties that were less about direct combat and more about maintaining order and observing local activities. They witnessed the arduous nature of the fishing trade, the intimate knowledge of the sea required, and the inherent risks involved. While official directives emphasized vigilance against any form of collaboration or sympathy, the sheer isolation and the shared struggle against the unforgiving Norwegian sea fostered an unexpected, albeit cautious, form of mutual respect. Consider the case of Sergeant Klaus Fischer, stationed in a small village on the Lofoten Islands. His patrol route frequently took him along the docks where local fishermen mended their nets and prepared their boats. Initially, his interactions were purely functional, ensuring no prohibited activities were taking place. However, he began to notice the fishermen's uncanny ability to predict weather patterns, their deep understanding of the currents, and their sheer resilience in the face of treacherous conditions. One particularly harsh winter, a severe storm trapped several fishing vessels at sea, including one belonging to a fisherman named Lars, who had always maintained a stoic, if wary, distance from the occupying soldiers. Hoffman's unit had received intelligence suggesting some local fishermen might be aiding downed Allied pilots. However, observing Lars's desperation as the storm intensified, and remembering the man's consistent, albeit silent, adherence to curfew and other regulations, Fisher made a calculated decision. Instead of reporting Lars's prolonged and risky departure to sea, Fisher subtly altered his patrol log, noting only that the fishermen were securing their vessels against the inclement weather. Now consider how this principle applies when you witness individuals operating within a system, whose actions, while potentially perceived as non-compliant, are primarily driven by the urgent need to navigate dangerous circumstances or protect vital resources, thereby posing no genuine threat to overarching stability. Furthermore, This scenario introduces a fascinating dimension of wartime interaction, the role of environmental shared adversity in fostering a form of implicit solidarity. The Norwegian Sea, with its unpredictable fury, acted as a common, impersonal adversary for both the German soldiers and the Norwegian fishermen. Both groups were subject to its power, and both understood the profound respect it demanded. This shared environmental challenge created a common ground, a recognition of mutual vulnerability that, for a fleeting moment, transcended the imposed animosity of war. Fisher, by choosing to overlook Lars's potentially unsanctioned maritime activity, was not engaging in overt defiance, but in a pragmatic acknowledgement of the sea's power and the fisherman's expertise. He understood that in this environment, survival often depended on a nuanced understanding of local knowledge, a knowledge that the fisherman possessed and he, as an outsider, did not. This highlights that acts of compassion during wartime are not always about direct intervention or grand pronouncements. They can manifest as subtle omissions, as a reinterpretation of duty, or as a quiet refusal to adhere strictly to directives that ignore the practical realities of a situation. Fisher's actions, while seemingly minor, represented a significant personal risk. By choosing to frame his observations in a way that protected Lars, he was subtly subverting the objectives of the occupation, albeit indirectly. This demonstrates that the capacity for moral agency persists even within rigid military structures, and that individuals can find ways to exercise their conscience, even in the most challenging circumstances. It's a testament to the idea that the human inclination towards fairness and recognition of struggle can find expression in unexpected ways, proving that even within the confines of occupation, the seeds of empathy can be sown through observation and a subtle re-evaluation of perceived threats. The shared environmental context, the omnipresent power of the sea, served as a silent negotiator, fostering a cautious understanding that ultimately prioritized human survival over rigid adherence to wartime protocols. The crucible of the Pacific theater, with its vast ocean expanses and island-hopping campaigns, presented a unique set of circumstances that tested the boundaries of human interaction. The intense, often brutal nature of jungle warfare and naval engagements fostered a deep sense of animosity between American and Japanese forces. Yet, even in this intensely adversarial environment, moments of unexpected grace could emerge, often driven by the sheer exigency of survival and a shared primal vulnerability. Consider the aftermath of a fierce naval battle, where shattered vessels lay strewn across the waves, and the sea became a chaotic tableau of debris and struggling men. In such scenarios, the lines of allegiance could, for a critical period, blur. Following a particularly devastating engagement in the Coral Sea, a downed American pilot found himself adrift on a makeshift raft, his body battered, his hope dwindling. He had witnessed his comrades perish, his aircraft consumed by flames. As the hours stretched into a second day, the sun beat down relentlessly, and the vast, indifferent ocean seemed to mock his desperation. Just as he began to succumb to dehydration and despair, a Japanese destroyer, itself damaged but still operational, appeared on the horizon. The pilot braced himself for the inevitable, capture or worse. However, as the destroyer drew closer, he observed a peculiar scene unfolding on its deck. Sailors, seemingly under the direction of an officer, were methodically casting life preservers and small rations of water into the sea, not in a targeted manner, but spread across a wide area. This was not a rescue operation in the conventional sense, nor was it a deliberate act of mercy towards a specific individual. Instead, it was an improvised, almost ritualistic response to the widespread distress evident in the water. The Japanese sailors, having just engaged in a life-or-death struggle, were now confronted with the visual evidence of its human cost. Their actions, though perhaps driven by a mix of ingrained maritime tradition and a pragmatic understanding that drowning men were a less immediate threat than active combatants, represented a significant departure from the expected animosity. They were, in essence, acknowledging the shared peril of those adrift, regardless of uniform. Now, consider how this principle applies when you witness individuals facing overwhelming, impersonal challenges, where the immediate focus shifts from conflict to survival. How can recognizing a shared struggle, even if born from the aftermath of hostility, foster a moment of unexpected solidarity, or at least a cessation of immediate antagonism? Furthermore, this scenario introduces a fascinating dynamic. empathy as an indirect, almost systemic response to shared vulnerability. The Japanese sailors were not directly interacting with the American pilot, nor were they necessarily motivated by a personal desire to save him. Instead, their actions were a collective, albeit uncoordinated response to the visible suffering surrounding them. This highlights that compassion can manifest not only through direct individual acts, but also through the established protocols or emergent behaviors within a group that implicitly acknowledge a shared human condition, even amidst conflict. The act of casting supplies into the sea, while not guaranteeing rescue for any one individual, represented a collective acknowledgement of the pervasive distress, a silent testament to the fact that the sea's destructive power affected all who were caught within its embrace. This also reveals a nuanced understanding of how wartime psychology can evolve. Following intense combat, the immediate adrenaline and aggression often subside, replaced by a profound awareness of loss and the fragility of life. For the Japanese sailors, witnessing the devastation wrought by the battle, their focus may have shifted from active aggression to a more passive, albeit still strategic, engagement with the consequences. The act of providing even minimal aid, while not negating their role as adversaries, represented a temporary suspension of lethal intent, a subtle recognition that the shared experience of combat had rendered them all, in a sense, survivors grappling with the immediate aftermath. It demonstrates that the human capacity for acknowledging suffering can persist even in the most adversarial contexts, finding expression through indirect actions that, while not overtly benevolent, still serve to mitigate the immediate peril, proving that the echoes of humanity can resonate even in the vast, indifferent expanse of the ocean. The complex interplay of occupation and civilian life in France during the latter years of the war often presented nuanced situations that transcended simple notions of enemy and ally. Consider the clandestine activities of individuals who, while outwardly complying with German regulations, engaged in subtle acts of resistance that were not about sabotage, but about preserving a sense of shared humanity. In a small town in Normandy, a retired schoolteacher, Monsieur Antoine Dubois, found himself in a precarious position. His home, due to its size and relative isolation, was occasionally requisitioned for billeting German officers. While outwardly maintaining a respectful distance, Dubois began to notice a pattern among some of the younger officers, a profound homesickness, often expressed through quiet conversations, or the meticulous care they took of personal mementos from home. Dubois, remembering his own son fighting on the front lines and the agonizing worry that consumed him, began to see these young men not solely as occupiers, but as individuals caught in the same maelstrom of war. He started, on occasion, to leave small anonymous offerings for them, a bowl of fresh soup left by the door on a particularly cold evening, a carefully folded newspaper from unoccupied France that might offer a different perspective, or even a brief handwritten note in German, expressing a simple wish for their safe return home. These were not acts of collaboration. They were acts of profound empathy, a recognition that the shared human experience of loss and longing could bridge even the most formidable divides. Dubois understood the immense risks involved, but he believed that fostering even a sliver of shared humanity was a form of quiet defiance against the dehumanizing forces of war. Now consider how this principle applies when you encounter individuals who, by circumstance or affiliation, might be perceived as other. How can small, seemingly insignificant acts of understanding or assistance create unexpected moments of connection, subtly shifting the dynamic from one of potential antagonism to one of shared humanity? Furthermore, this scenario introduces a crucial layer to the concept of wartime compassion, its manifestation through acts of indirect humanization. Dubois' actions were not about direct confrontation or overt support for the occupying forces. Instead, they were designed to subtly remind the soldiers of their own humanity, to acknowledge their existence as individuals with lives and loved ones beyond the uniform. By providing these small anonymous comforts, he was, in effect, challenging the rigid dichotomy of enemy and ally, suggesting that even within the framework of occupation, there was space for shared human experience. This highlights that empathy can be a powerful tool, not only for mitigating immediate suffering, but also for subtly undermining the dehumanizing narratives that fuel conflict. This also reveals a sophisticated understanding of psychological warfare, waged not with weapons, but with gestures of unexpected grace. Dubois' actions, while seemingly small, could have had a profound impact on the morale and perspective of the soldiers who received them. By being treated with a degree of unexpected kindness, these individuals might have begun to question the simplistic narratives of enmity that defined their wartime experience. This demonstrates that the human capacity for compassion can be a potent force for subversion, capable of creating cracks in the ideological armor that separates people, proving that even in the most oppressive circumstances, the quiet assertion of shared humanity can hold significant, albeit often unseen, power. The consistent, anonymous nature of his gestures ensured that they were perceived not as overt acts of aid, but as unexpected moments of grace, fostering a sense of bewilderment and perhaps a flicker of reconsideration about the nature of the people they occupied. The vast icy expanse of the Eastern Front often presented soldiers with a unique psychological landscape, far removed from the direct brutality of combat, yet deeply influenced by its pervasive presence. In the rear areas, particularly during the brutal winters, German soldiers were sometimes billeted in occupied villages, tasked with maintaining order and securing resources. It was in these relatively static environments that subtle, often unacknowledged forms of human connection could emerge, driven by shared isolation and the mundane realities of daily life. Consider the experience of a young German signals corporal, Dieter Schmidt, stationed in a small Ukrainian village. His primary duty was maintaining communication lines, a task that often involved long hours of solitary work in the biting cold, repairing damaged cables or setting up new relay points. During these solitary excursions, Schmidt began to observe the local villagers, particularly the elderly women who seemed to possess an almost innate resilience. He noticed how they would share their meager rations, how they would offer quiet words of comfort to one another, and how they, despite the harsh occupation, continued to nurture small gardens, planting seeds for a future they might not see. One elderly woman, in particular Elena, whose son had been conscripted into the Red Army, became a silent point of observation for Schmidt. He saw her tending to a small patch of frozen ground, trying to coax life from the seemingly dead earth. He also observed her quiet acts of sharing, a handful of dried berries offered to a neighbor, a shared pot of thin soup. Schmidt, himself missing his family and yearning for a connection beyond the rigid confines of military life, began to feel a peculiar sense of kinship with these women and their quiet determination. He never directly interacted with Elena in a way that would compromise his duty or her safety. However, on his patrols, he would sometimes overlook minor infractions, such as a slightly extended curfew breach when Elena was seen returning from a clandestine foraging trip, or he might subtly reroute his patrols to avoid disturbing the villagers during their most vulnerable hours. This was not an act of overt defiance, but a quiet, almost subconscious act of empathy. He recognized in their struggle for survival a reflection of his own underlying anxieties and a shared human desire for continuity and hope. Now, consider how this principle applies when you witness individuals engaged in actions that, while seemingly minor or even slightly non-compliant with established rules, are motivated by a deep-seated need for connection, hope, or the preservation of essential life-sustaining practices. How can a subtle reinterpretation of observation, a quiet overlooking of minor deviations, foster a sense of shared humanity and de-escalate potential conflict? Building on this, another crucial layer to this phenomenon is the psychological impact of prolonged exposure to civilian life on occupying soldiers. When soldiers are removed from the immediate intensity of combat and placed in environments where they witness the daily lives of the occupied population, their perceptions can gradually shift. The abstract notion of the enemy can begin to dissolve, replaced by a more nuanced understanding of individuals grappling with their own unique set of challenges. Schmidt's observations of Elena's quiet acts of resilience and sharing likely triggered a recognition of shared human values, the desire to nurture, to connect, and to maintain hope even in the bleakest circumstances. This gradual humanization process, though often subconscious, can lead to a softening of rigid adherence to military directives, paving the way for acts of subtle, indirect compassion. This also reveals a fascinating aspect of wartime psychology: the emergence of empathy through shared environmental and existential pressures, even when direct interaction is limited. Schmidt's empathy for Elena wasn't born from shared conversations or overt acts of kindness between them. Instead, it stemmed from his observation of her quiet determination in the face of overwhelming hardship, a determination that resonated with his own underlying anxieties and his longing for connection. His subsequent overlooking of minor infractions was a silent acknowledgement of this shared struggle, a subtle act of solidarity that transcended the imposed boundaries of war. It demonstrates that the human capacity for recognizing and responding to shared vulnerability can manifest in subtle, indirect ways, proving that even in the most isolating of circumstances, the echoes of our shared humanity can find expression, fostering a quiet understanding that defies the logic of conflict. The consistent observation of Elena's quiet acts of nurturing and sharing, in contrast to the pervasive destruction of war, likely served as a powerful reminder of life's enduring continuity. The intense ideological indoctrination and the sheer scale of the conflict on the Eastern Front created a psychological environment where the dehumanization of the enemy was not merely encouraged, but often mandated. Yet even within this meticulously constructed framework of animosity, pockets of profound ethical awareness persisted, often manifesting in ways that defied easy categorization. Consider the experience of German medical personnel in field hospitals, confronted daily with the devastating injuries sustained by their own men, but also, at times, by captured enemy soldiers. While official protocols dictated different standards of care based on nationality, the sheer volume of casualties and the universal nature of suffering could, for some, create a moral quandary. A poignant example comes from a German field surgeon, Dr. Erich Müller, stationed near the front lines in late 1944. His hospital was overwhelmed with wounded from a recent offensive. Among the casualties brought in were several severely injured Soviet soldiers. Standard procedure dictated that they receive only rudimentary, life-saving treatment, with a clear priority placed on German personnel. However, Dr. Müller, a man who had dedicated his life to healing, found himself deeply disturbed by the visible agony of a young Soviet conscript, barely conscious, his leg mangled by shrapnel. The young man's condition was critical, and without extensive surgical intervention, his chances of survival were minimal, regardless of the care provided. The lessons gleaned from these historical fragments are not confined to the annals of the past. They extend into our present, urging us to recognize the echoes of humanity in our own lives. The practice of empathy, of extending understanding and compassion, is not a passive observation of historical events, but an active engagement with our own capacity for connection. It is in the everyday interactions, in the seemingly small choices we make, that the true legacy of these wartime gestures can be realized. The recognition that the other is, at their core, a fellow traveler on this complex journey of existence is a powerful insight that can reshape our perspectives and foster a more humane world. The true practice begins now, in the conscious choice to seek out and nurture these echoes, to cultivate the seeds of kindness, and to understand that even in the most challenging of circumstances, the enduring strength of our shared humanity can prevail.